Hey guys, tonight we begin with something truly horrifying. A time when death walked the streets like a neighbor, and survival was nothing but dumb luck. We're diving into the plague years when Europe became one massive graveyard. Forget everything you think you know about life in the Middle Ages. When the Black Death arrived, even hell looked like paradise. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year was 1347, and Europe was a continent on the brink of unimaginable horror, but nobody knew it yet. In the bustling port cities of Italy, merchants counted their coins and planned their next voyages. In the countryside of England, peasants prepared for another harsh winter. In the great cathedrals of France, priests offered prayers for good harvests and peaceful times. Life was hard, yes, but it was predictable. People knew their place in the world, and death, while always present, came in familiar forms: war, famine, accident, old age. What they couldn't know was that something far worse was already making its way across the Mediterranean, carried in the belly holds of trading ships and the bloodstreams of infected rats. Europe in the 1340s was a tapestry of contrasts. The continent was experiencing what historians would later call a period of relative prosperity. The population had been growing steadily for centuries, reaching heights not seen since the fall of Rome. Great cities like Paris, London, and Venice teemed with life. Marketplaces overflowed with goods from distant lands. Spices from the east, furs from the north, wines from the south. The Crusades had opened new trade routes, and the merchant class was becoming wealthy and influential. Magnificent cathedrals rose toward the heavens, their spires reaching heights that seemed to touch God himself. Universities flourished in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, centers of learning where scholars debated theology and philosophy. But beneath this veneer of prosperity lay deep structural problems that would make the coming plague far more devastating than it might otherwise have been. The population boom had pushed the limits of agricultural production. Forests had been cleared to make room for farmland, and even marginal lands were being cultivated. The climate was becoming colder and wetter, leading to crop failures and famine. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 had already weakened the population, leaving millions malnourished and vulnerable to disease. Social tensions were rising as the gap between rich and poor widened. Peasants were bound to the land in a system of serfdom that offered little hope of advancement, while nobles lived in luxury that seemed almost obscene by comparison. The cities, despite their apparent prosperity, were crowded, filthy, and disease-ridden. Sanitation was primitive at best. Human waste was often simply thrown into the streets or dumped into rivers that served as both sewers and sources of drinking water. Houses were built close together, with entire families often living in single rooms. Privacy was a luxury that few could afford. The air was thick with smoke from countless fires, and the smell of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and animal excrement was a constant presence. Rats thrived in these conditions, breeding in the garbage heaps and dark corners of every building. Nobody paid much attention to them. They were just part of life, as common and unremarkable as fleas or lice. Trade was the lifeblood of this world, connecting distant regions in an increasingly complex web of commerce. Silk Road caravans brought goods from Asia, while Mediterranean ships carried products from North Africa and the Middle East. Italian merchants had established trading posts from the Black Sea to the Atlantic, creating networks that spanned continents. But these same networks that brought prosperity would soon become highways of death. Every ship that docked, every caravan that arrived, every trader who crossed a border was a potential carrier of something far more dangerous than any cargo. The church dominated every aspect of life. Cathedral bells marked the hours and religious festivals punctuated the calendar. People believed that God controlled everything: the weather, the harvest, health, sickness, life, and death. Disease was often seen as divine punishment for sin, either individual or collective. When illness struck, the first response was not to seek medical treatment, but to pray, confess, and hope for divine mercy. Doctors existed, but they were few in number and their knowledge was limited. Medical education was based largely on ancient texts by Galen and Hippocrates, with little understanding of how diseases actually spread, or how to treat them effectively. The feudal system created a rigid social hierarchy that would prove disastrous when crisis struck. At the top were the kings and great nobles, who owned vast estates and commanded the loyalty of lesser lords. Below them were the knights and minor nobles, who held land in exchange for military service. At the bottom were the peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population. They were bound to the land, unable to leave without their lord's permission, and subject to numerous taxes and obligations. This system worked reasonably well in times of stability, but it was poorly equipped to deal with a crisis that would kill indiscriminately across all social classes. Communication was slow and unreliable. News traveled at the speed of a horse or a ship, which meant that important information could take weeks or months to spread across the continent. There were no newspapers, no postal systems, no way to quickly warn distant communities about approaching dangers. When reports of a strange new disease began to filter in from the east, they were often dismissed as rumors or exaggerations. Even when the plague reached Italy, many people in Northern Europe remained unaware of the catastrophe that was heading their way. The military technology of the age was crude but effective. Knights in heavy armor dominated the battlefield, supported by crossbowmen and foot soldiers armed with spears and swords. Castles provided strongholds that could withstand lengthy sieges, while city walls offered protection from raiders and invaders. But all of these defenses would prove useless against an enemy that could not be fought with sword or lance. An enemy that slipped through the strongest fortifications like smoke through a keyhole. Art and literature flourished in this period, producing works of breathtaking beauty and sophistication. The Gothic style reached its peak in the great cathedrals of Chartres, Notre Dame, and Westminster Abbey. Poets like Dante and Chaucer created masterpieces that would endure for centuries. Illuminated manuscripts, created by patient monks in monastery scriptoriums, preserved knowledge and created objects of stunning visual beauty. Music evolved from simple Gregorian chant to complex polyphonic compositions that filled cathedral spaces with sound that seemed to come from heaven itself. But there were also darker currents running through society. Superstition was widespread, and belief in witchcraft, demons, and supernatural forces was almost universal. Jews faced periodic persecution and were often blamed for natural disasters or economic problems. The Inquisition sought out heretics with ruthless efficiency, and public executions were common forms of entertainment. Violence was an accepted part of life, whether in the form of warfare between nobles, public punishments for criminals, or simple brawls in taverns and marketplaces. The economy was largely agricultural, with most people involved in farming or related activities. Towns and cities were growing, but they still depended on the surrounding countryside for food and raw materials. Craft guilds controlled manufacturing and trade in urban areas, maintaining strict standards and limiting competition. Money was becoming more important, but barter was still common, especially in rural areas. The banking industry was in its infancy, centered primarily in Italian cities like Florence and Venice. Technology was advancing slowly but steadily. Watermills and windmills provided power for grinding grain and other tasks. The heavy plow made it possible to cultivate previously unworkable soils. New techniques in metallurgy improved the quality of tools and weapons, But the pace of change was glacial compared to what would come later, and most people lived and worked much as their ancestors had for generations. As 3047 drew to a close, Europe stood at the peak of its medieval achievement. The population had never been larger, trade had never been more extensive, and culture had never been more sophisticated. Great projects were underway, new cathedrals rising toward the sky, new territories being explored and settled, new ideas being debated in universities and courts. The future seemed bright, full of promise and possibility. But in the ports of Crimea, something unspeakable was stirring. Traders and sailors were falling ill with a mysterious disease that killed with terrifying speed. Entire ships' crews were dying before they could reach their destinations. And slowly, inexorably, this plague of plagues was beginning its westward journey, carried by fleas on rats in the holds of trading vessels, spreading through the very networks that had brought Europe such prosperity. The people of Europe went to sleep that winter, believing in a world where hard work was rewarded, where faith provided protection, where the future would be much like the past. They had no way of knowing that they were about to witness the end of everything they had ever known. The Black Death was coming, and when it arrived, it would transform Europe from a continent of hope into a continent of horror. The medieval world was about to die, and its death would be neither quick nor merciful. The plague didn't announce itself with trumpets or banners. It crept into Europe like a thief in the night, hidden in the bellies of trading ships and the fur of seemingly innocent rats. The first victims had no idea they were witnessing the beginning of the greatest catastrophe in human history. They thought they were just getting sick. It began in the trading posts of the Black Sea, in the bustling port city of Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia, in Crimea. This was a Genoese colony, a vital link in the chain of commerce that connected Europe to Asia. Italian merchants had established themselves there to trade in silk, spices, and precious stones brought by caravans from the Far East. The city was prosperous, cosmopolitan, and seemingly secure behind its strong walls. But prosperity and walls meant nothing to the enemy that was approaching. The plague had been traveling for years before it reached Kaffa. It had started somewhere in the steppes of Central Asia, possibly in the regions that are now Mongolia or Kazakhstan. Historians believe it may have been the same disease that Chinese chronicles described devastating populations there in the bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas that lived on black rats, had found the perfect conditions to spread dense populations of both humans and rodents, extensive trade networks, and a climate that favored its survival. The disease followed the Silk Road westward, killing as it went. Entire trading posts were abandoned. Caravans arrived at their destinations with nothing but corpses and rotting goods. But the scale of the catastrophe wasn't yet apparent to those living through it. Communication was slow, and news of distant deaths was often dismissed as exaggeration or rumor. Even when reliable reports reached the trading centers of the Black Sea, merchants were reluctant to abandon their lucrative businesses. After all, they reasoned, disease had always been a risk of trade. This couldn't be much different from the various fevers and fluxes that occasionally swept through population. They were catastrophically wrong. In 3046, the plague reached Kaffa in force. The disease struck the local population with unprecedented violence. Unlike the familiar illnesses that people knew how to treat, at least to some degree, this new pestilence seemed to kill almost everyone it touched. Victims developed painful swellings in their groins, armpits, and necks. These bobos, as they came to be called, could grow to the size of apples and were excruciatingly painful. Fever followed, along with chills, vomiting, and often delirium. Most victims died within 3 to 5 days of showing symptoms, though some lasted longer in agony, and others died even more quickly. The Mongol army that was besieging Kaffa at the time found itself decimated by the disease. But in their desperation and rage, they hit upon a weapon more terrible than any sword or catapult. According to chroniclers, they began loading their catapults with the corpses of plague victims and hurling them over the city walls. Whether this primitive form of biological warfare was actually effective in spreading the disease is debatable, since the plague was already present in the city. But the psychological impact was devastating. The defenders found themselves trapped in a city of the dead, surrounded by enemies who were literally throwing death at them. As the siege collapsed and the Mongol army disintegrated under the weight of disease, the surviving Genoese merchants made a fateful decision. Rather than remain in a city that had become a charnel house, they loaded their ships and fled westward toward home. They carried with them their most precious goods, their hopes for survival, and unknowingly, the very plague they were trying to escape. The rats that lived in the ship's holds were infected with plague-carrying fleas, and some of the sailors were already showing symptoms of the disease. The journey home became a nightmare voyage. Ship after ship fell silent, as crews died at their posts. Some vessels were found drifting empty, their cargo intact but their crews reduced to rotting corpses. Others limped into ports with only a handful of survivors, men who were often too sick to speak coherently about what had happened to their companions. But still the ships kept coming, because the survivors didn't yet understand that they were carrying death itself in their holds. October 1347 marked the beginning of Europe's darkest hour. A fleet of Genoese galleys arrived at the port of Messina in Sicily. The ships were in terrible condition, their sails torn, their hulls damaged. But it was the state of the crews that truly horrified the dockworkers who came to greet them. Most of the sailors were dead, their bodies covered in black boils and lying in pools of their own blood and vomit. Those who were still alive were delirious with fever, barely able to speak, and clearly dying. The authorities in Messina, recognizing that something terrible had arrived with these ships, ordered them to leave the harbor immediately. But it was already too late. The rats had come ashore, carrying their infected fleas with them. Within days, people in Messina began falling ill with the same mysterious disease that had killed the sailors. The symptoms were unmistakable: the painful swellings, the fever, the rapid decline toward death. From Sicily, the plague spread with terrifying speed. It followed the trade routes that connected the island to the rest of Europe, moving faster than any army had ever moved. Ships carried it to the ports of mainland Italy, to Sardinia and Corsica, to the coasts of France and Spain. Overland it traveled with merchants and pilgrims, with armies and refugees, with anyone who moved from place to place in the course of their daily lives. The disease reached Genoa and Venice almost simultaneously in January 1348. These great trading cities, the source of so much of Europe's prosperity, became centers of death and despair. In Venice, the city of canals became a city of floating corpses as bodies were loaded onto barges and taken out to sea for disposal. Genoa saw its population decimated so quickly that there weren't enough people left to maintain basic service. The very trade networks that had made these cities wealthy now became the highways along which death traveled. Marseille fell to the plague in the same month. This ancient port city, gateway to France, found itself overwhelmed by a disease unlike anything in living memory. The local physicians, trained in the medical knowledge of the time, were completely baffled. Their traditional treatments of bloodletting, purging, and balancing the humors not only failed to help, but often seemed to make patients worse. Many doctors fled the city rather than continue to face a disease they couldn't understand or treat. By spring of 1348, the plague had reached Paris, the capital of France, one of the largest and most important cities in Europe, found itself under siege by an invisible enemy. The disease spread through the crowded neighborhoods with horrifying efficiency. Entire families died within days of each other. Guilds lost most of their members. Monasteries, where monks lived in close quarters and cared for the sick, were virtually wiped out. The University of Paris, one of the great centers of learning in Europe, closed as professors and students died or fled. The pattern was the same everywhere. The plague struck. First came reports of a strange new disease in nearby areas. These were often dismissed or downplayed by local authorities who didn't want to damage trade or cause panic. Then the first cases appeared locally, usually connected to travelers or traders from affected areas. At first, the numbers were small and manageable. Local physicians would be consulted, prayers would be offered, and life would continue more or less normally. But then the explosion came. Within weeks, sometimes within days, the disease would be everywhere. The careful social order that governed daily life would begin to break down as essential workers fell ill. Markets would close as vendors died or fled. Churches would be overwhelmed with funeral services, then close as priests died. Government would cease to function as officials succumbed to the disease. London received its first taste of the plague in August 1348. Brought by ships trading across the English Channel. The great city, with its narrow streets and crowded tenements, proved to be ideal breeding ground for the disease. The Thames, which served as both a highway for commerce and a sewer for waste, became clogged with bodies. Westminster Abbey began keeping records of the dead, but soon gave up as the numbers became too overwhelming to track accurately. The speed of the plague spread was unprecedented in human experience. Medieval people were accustomed to diseases that moved slowly, affecting some areas while leaving others untouched for years. But this plague seemed to be everywhere at once, striking with such speed that communities had no time to prepare or adapt. A city could be healthy in the morning and see its first deaths by evening. A village could lose half its population in a week. Germany felt the plague's touch in the summer of 1348. The great cities of the Rhine, Cologne, Mainz, Frankfurt, fell one by one. In Cologne, the city's extensive trade connections, which had brought it wealth and influence, now brought death. The cathedral, one of the largest construction projects in Europe, saw work halt as craftsmen died or fled. The city's Jewish quarter was attacked by mobs who blamed the plague on supposed well poisoning, beginning a pattern of scapegoating that would spread across the continent. By the end of 1348, the plague had reached as far north as Norway and as far west as Ireland. Ships brought it to the Orkney Islands and Iceland. Overland routes carried it to Poland and Hungary. The disease seemed unstoppable, moving with inexorable persistence through every barrier that medieval society could erect. Neither mountains nor seas, neither walls nor armies, could slow its advance. The plague showed no respect for social boundaries. Kings and peasants died with equal ease. The powerful found that their wealth and influence meant nothing to a disease that killed indiscriminately. Pope Clement VI, safe in his palace at Avignon, watched helplessly as cardinals and bishops died around him. The royal courts of Europe saw princes and nobles succumb as readily as any commoner. What made the plague so devastating was not just its lethality, but its unpredictability. Some communities were wiped out entirely, while neighboring areas might be barely touched. Some individuals seemed immune, nursing sick family members without falling ill themselves, while others died after minimal exposure. This randomness added to the terror, making it impossible for people to feel safe no matter how many precautions they took. The three forms of plague, bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic, each brought their own horrors. Bubonic plague, the most common form, caused the characteristic swellings that gave the disease its name. Pneumonic plague attacked the lungs, causing victims to cough up blood and die gasping for breath. Septicemic plague poisoned the blood directly, causing rapid death often before other symptoms appeared. All three forms could be present in the same outbreak, creating a medical nightmare that overwhelmed any attempt at treatment. As 3048 turned to 11349, it became clear that Europe was facing something unprecedented in human history. This wasn't just another epidemic that would burn through the population and fade away. This was a fundamental transformation of human society, a reshaping of civilization itself. The old world, with its certainties and traditions, was dying along with its people. What would emerge from the ashes of this catastrophe was anybody's guess, but it would never be the same again. The Black Death had arrived, and Europe would never recover from its kiss. To understand the true horror of the Black Death, one must understand what it meant to watch a human being die from the plague. This wasn't the peaceful passing of old age or the quick release of a battlefield wound. This was a prolonged, agonizing descent into hell that could last anywhere from hours to weeks, depending on which form of the disease had taken hold. The plague announced its presence in the human body with a cruelty that seemed almost deliberate. For most victims, the first sign wasn't pain or visible symptoms, but a subtle change in how they felt. They might wake up feeling slightly off, perhaps attributing it to bad food or too much ale the night before. There was often a sense of unease, a feeling that something wasn't quite right, though they couldn't put their finger on what exactly was wrong. Within hours, however, the disease began to show its true nature. The first real symptom was usually fever, but not the mild warmth of a common cold. This was a burning, consuming heat that seemed to come from deep within the body. Victims described feeling as though they were being cooked from the inside out. Their skin became hot to the touch, and they would sweat profusely, soaking through their clothes and bedding. Yet paradoxically, they would also experience violent chills, shivering uncontrollably even as their bodies burned with fever. The headaches that accompanied the fever were described by survivors as unlike anything they had ever experienced. It wasn't just pain, but a crushing pressure that felt as though their skulls were being squeezed in a giant vice. Many victims became delirious from the combination of fever and pain, speaking to people who weren't there, seeing visions of demons or angels, or becoming completely incoherent. Some would scream continuously until their voices gave out, while others fell into a stupor from which they could barely be roused. But it was the swellings that truly marked someone as a victim of the Black Death. These buboes, as they came to be called, usually appeared within the first day or two of illness. They typically developed in the lymph nodes closest to where the plague bacteria had entered the body. If the victim had been bitten by an infected flea on the leg, the buboes would appear in the groin. If the bite was on the arm or torso, the swellings would emerge in the armpit. In some cases, they would develop on the neck, just below the jawline. These buboes started small, perhaps the size of a walnut, but they grew rapidly. Within hours, they could expand to the size of a chicken egg, and in extreme cases, they might grow as large as apples. The skin over them became stretched and shiny, taking on a dark purplish color that gave the disease part of its name. The buboes were excruciatingly painful. Victims couldn't bear to have them touched, and even the weight of clothing against them was agony. Some tried to lance them with knives or hot irons, but this usually only made the suffering worse and hastened death through blood loss or secondary infection. The pain from the buboes was constant and unrelenting. It was a deep, throbbing agony that seemed to pulse with the victim's heartbeat. Many described it as feeling like red-hot coals had been placed under their skin. The pain was so intense that it prevented sleep, and victims would lie awake hour after hour, groaning and writhing in torment. Some would beg their families to kill them rather than endure another moment of such suffering. As the disease progressed, other symptoms would join the fever and babos. Vomiting was common, often violent and continuous. Victims would bring up everything they had eaten, then continue retching long after their stomachs were empty, producing only bile and blood. The vomit itself often had a distinctive smell that experienced plague watchers learned to recognize. It was sweet and cloying, with an undertone of decay that seemed to emanate from the victim's rotting insides. Diarrhea was another common symptom, and like the vomiting, it was often bloody. Victims would lose control of their bowels, lying in their own waste as their bodies expelled every fluid they contained. The smell in a plague house became overwhelming, a mixture of sweat, vomit, blood, and human waste that seemed to seep into the very walls. Families would try to clean their sick relatives, but with multiple victims in a single household, and with the disease striking the caregivers as well, basic hygiene became impossible to maintain. The skin itself would begin to change as the disease progressed. Dark spots would appear, usually starting small but growing larger as time passed. These weren't just bruises, but areas where blood vessels had burst under the skin, creating patches of black and purple that looked like enormous bruises. In severe cases, these spots would merge together, giving the victim's skin a mottled, blackened appearance that was the source of the disease's most common name. Breathing became increasingly difficult as the plague attacked the victim's lungs. Even in cases that started as bubonic plague, the disease often spread to the respiratory system, causing a racking cough that brought up blood and pus. Victims would gasp for air like fish out of water, their chests heaving as they struggled to get enough oxygen. The sound of plague victims' breathing was distinctive, a wet, rattling wheeze that could be heard throughout a house. Some victims developed a particularly horrific form of the disease that attacked the lungs directly. This pneumonic plague was the most feared variant because it could spread from person to person through coughing and breathing, without requiring flea bites. Victims of pneumonic plague would cough up massive amounts of blood, sometimes drowning in their own fluids. They would die gasping and choking, their faces turning blue from lack of oxygen, while blood poured from their mouths and noses. The septicemic form of plague was perhaps the most terrifying because of its speed. In these cases, the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, poisoning the victim's blood before bobules had time to form. These victims might seem relatively healthy in the morning and be dead by evening. Their skin would turn black rapidly, giving them an appearance of having been burned alive. Some would fall down dead in the streets without warning, causing panic among witnesses who didn't understand what they had seen. The psychological effects of the plague were as devastating as the physical symptoms. Victims who remained conscious often experienced profound terror, not just of death, but of what would happen to them after death. Many believed that the plague was a punishment from God, and they feared that their suffering on earth was just a preview of eternal torment in hell. They would confess their sins obsessively, begging for forgiveness from anyone who would listen. Delirium was common in the later stages of the disease. Victims would rave about demons coming to take them away, or they would claim to see dead relatives beckoning to them. Some would try to get out of bed and walk around despite being too weak to stand, requiring family members to restrain them. Others would lie perfectly still for hours, staring at the ceiling with an expression of absolute terror frozen on their faces. The process of dying from plague was rarely quick or merciful. Most victims lingered for 3 to 5 days after symptoms appeared, though some suffered for a week or more. During this time, their families would watch helplessly as their loved ones wasted away before their eyes. There was nothing they could do to ease the suffering. No medicine that could help. No treatment that offered hope. Children were particularly heartbreaking to watch. They didn't understand what was happening to them, crying for their mothers to make the pain stop, begging for water that they couldn't keep down, asking when they would feel better. Parents would hold their dying children, feeling the fever burning through their small bodies, watching the life drain from their eyes, and knowing that they were powerless to save them. The final stages of plague death were marked by a series of unmistakable signs. The victim's temperature would often drop suddenly, giving false hope to family members who thought the fever had broken. But this was actually a sign that the body's systems were shutting down. The skin would become cold and clammy, taking on a grayish pallor that made the victim look already dead. Breathing would become increasingly shallow and irregular. Long pauses would develop between breaths, sometimes lasting so long that watchers thought the victim had already died. The pulse would become weak and thready, barely detectable even to experienced healers. The victim would often lose consciousness during these final hours, though some remained awake until the very end, their eyes wide with fear or pain. The actual moment of death was often accompanied by a final convulsion or gasp. The victim's back would arch, their eyes would roll back, and they would expel a last breath that carried with it all the foul odors of their decaying body. Sometimes there would be a final cry or moan, a last expression of the agony they had endured. Then stillness would settle over the room, broken only by the sobbing of the survivor. But even death didn't end the horror for the families left behind. The bodies of plague victims were considered dangerous, and with good reason. They continued to harbor the disease, carrying fleas that had infected them in the first place. Yet someone had to dispose of the corpses, and in most cases, this burden fell to family members who were themselves likely to be infected soon. The speed with which plague victims decomposed was another source of horror. In the heat of summer, bodies would begin to rot within hours of death. The smell would become overwhelming, and the appearance of the corpses would change rapidly. Families who had been too weak or too few in number to remove their dead quickly would find themselves living with rotting corpses, sometimes for days. In many cases, entire families would die within a few days of each other, leaving no one to care for the bodies. Houses would be found weeks later containing multiple corpses in various stages of decomposition. Neighbors, terrified of contracting the disease themselves, would avoid these plague houses, allowing them to become monuments to the dead. The disease showed no mercy based on age, sex, or social status. Infants died as readily as adults, and pregnant women often lost both their own lives and those of their unborn children. The plague would sometimes strike down the strongest and healthiest individuals while sparing the weak and elderly, adding to the sense that there was no logic or justice to who lived and who died. Perhaps most cruel of all was the disease's tendency to kill some family members, while sparing others, often for no apparent reason. A mother might watch all of her children die while remaining healthy herself. A man might lose his wife and parents, but survive to face a future alone. These survivors often suffered from what would now be recognized as severe psychological trauma, haunted by the memories of their loved ones' deaths and consumed by guilt at their own survival. The Black Death didn't just kill people. It destroyed the very fabric of human relationships. It made caring for the sick a potentially fatal act, turned love into a liability, and transformed the most basic human impulse to help others into a dangerous gamble with death itself. This was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the plague. It didn't just take lives, it took away people's ability to be human in the face of suffering. When the Black Death arrived in a community, it didn't just kill people. It systematically dismantled every aspect of normal life, reducing once thriving settlements to ghost towns filled with rotting corpses and abandoned homes. The collapse wasn't gradual or partial. It was complete, total, and terrifyingly swift. The first sign that a community was losing its battle against the plague was usually the silence. Towns and villages that had once buzzed with activity from dawn to dusk would grow eerily quiet, The constant background noise of daily life, children playing in the streets, merchants hawking their wares, craftsmen hammering at their work, animals lowing and bleating, would fade away bit by bit until an unnatural stillness settled over everything. Markets, which served as the beating hearts of medieval communities, were among the first casualties. These weren't just places of commerce, but social centers, where people gathered to exchange news, gossip, and maintain the bonds that held society together. When the plague struck, vendors began staying away, either because they were sick, dead, or too frightened to venture out among crowds. Those who did come found fewer and fewer customers willing to risk exposure by shopping in public spaces. The collapse of the markets had immediate and devastating consequences. Food distribution, which depended on these weekly gatherings, broke down almost instantly. Farmers who lived outside the towns were often among the first to die, as they worked closely with animals and lived in conditions that favored the spread of disease. Even those who survived were reluctant to bring their produce to infected towns, preferring to let their crops rot in the fields rather than risk their lives for money that might be worthless if there was no one left alive to trade with. Within days of the market's collapse, hunger would begin to stalk the survivors. Wealthy families might have stores of grain and preserved foods that could last for weeks or months, but the poor, who lived from day to day, faced starvation almost immediately. Bread, the staple food that sustained most of the population, became increasingly scarce as bakers died or fled. Those bakeries that remained open faced impossible choices: continue working and risk infection, or close and condemn their customers to hunger. The breakdown of food distribution created a vicious cycle that accelerated the community's collapse. Hungry people became desperate, leading to increased crime and social disorder. Starving individuals would break into abandoned homes looking for anything edible, sometimes finding nothing but corpses. Groups of survivors would fight over the remaining food supplies, turning neighbors into enemies and destroying the social bonds that had once provided mutual support during times of crisis. Water, the most basic necessity of life, also became a problem. Medieval water systems were primitive at best, relying on wells, springs, and rivers that were often contaminated even under normal circumstances. When the plague struck, these systems broke down completely. The people responsible for maintaining wells and cisterns died or fled. Rivers became clogged with corpses, making the water not just undrinkable but actively dangerous. Rainwater, collected in barrels and cisterns, became stagnant and foul when no one was left alive to maintain the collection systems. In cities, the water crisis was particularly acute. Urban populations depended on complex systems of aqueducts, canals, and distribution networks that required constant maintenance. When the workers who operated these systems died, the flow of clean water stopped. Citizens found themselves drinking from polluted sources or going without water entirely. Dehydration weakened those who were still healthy, making them more susceptible to disease, while the lack of water for washing and cleaning created conditions that favored the spread of infection. The disposal of waste, always a challenge in medieval communities, became an insurmountable problem during the plague years. In normal times, human waste was collected by designated workers and either composted for use as fertilizer or dumped in designated areas outside town walls. When these workers died, waste began to accumulate in streets, houses, and public spaces. The smell became overwhelming, and the unsanitary conditions created breeding grounds for rats and other disease vectors. Corpse disposal presented an even more pressing problem. In normal times, the dead were prepared for burial by family members or professional mourners, blessed by priests, and interred in consecrated ground with proper ceremonies. But when deaths numbered in the hundreds or thousands, this careful system broke down completely. Families found themselves with multiple dead relatives, and no one to help them dispose of the bodies. Professional grave diggers died or refused to work. Priests, who traditionally oversaw burials, were among the hardest hit by the plague due to their close contact with the sick and dying. The accumulation of corpses in homes and streets created a horror that defied description. Bodies would lie where they fell for days or weeks, decomposing in the open air and filling entire neighborhoods with the stench of death. Survivors described the smell as something that got into your clothes, your hair, your very skin, a sweet, cloying odor that seemed to follow you everywhere and served as a constant reminder of the mortality that surrounded you. In desperation, communities began adopting increasingly drastic measures for corpse disposal. Mass graves, or plague pits, were dug outside town walls. These enormous excavations could hold hundreds of bodies, which were dumped in without ceremony or individual burial. In some cases, bodies were simply loaded onto carts and taken outside the settlement to be burned in massive pyres that filled the sky with black smoke and ash. The traditional rituals of death, which had provided comfort to the bereaved for centuries, were abandoned in favor of crude efficiency. The breakdown of burial customs had profound psychological effects on the survivors. In medieval society, proper burial was believed to be essential for the soul's journey to the afterlife. When bodies were dumped into mass graves or burned without ceremony, families worried that their loved ones would be denied salvation. This spiritual crisis compounded the physical horrors of the plague, leaving survivors not just bereaved, but tormented by fears for their relatives' eternal souls. Religious services, which had provided structure and meaning to medieval life, became impossible to maintain. Churches that had once offered daily masses and regular services fell silent as priests died or fled. Those clergymen who remained often found themselves overwhelmed by the number of last rites they were asked to perform. Some priests worked themselves to death trying to serve their flocks, visiting the sick despite the obvious dangers. Others barricaded themselves in their churches or fled to remote monasteries, abandoning their congregations to face death without spiritual comfort. The absence of religious services had effects that went far beyond spiritual comfort. Church bells had served as the community's clock, marking the hours of the day and calling people to prayer and work. When the bell towers fell silent, people lost track of time itself. The rhythm of daily life, which had been structured around religious observances for centuries, simply disappeared. People found themselves adrift in time, unsure even of what day it was, as the familiar markers that had organized their lives vanished along with the people who had maintained them. Craftsmen and artisans, who formed the backbone of medieval economic life, were among the early casualties of social breakdown. These skilled workers lived and worked in close quarters, often in guilds that required regular meetings and collaborative work. When the plague struck, entire workshops would be wiped out within days. Master craftsmen who had spent decades perfecting their skills would die, taking their knowledge with them to the grave. Apprentices who might have carried on the trades had neither the experience nor the authority to continue the work on their own. The loss of skilled workers had immediate practical consequences. Blacksmiths who made and repaired tools were gone, leaving farmers unable to maintain their equipment. Carpenters who built and maintained houses disappeared, leaving survivors with no way to repair damage from weather or neglect. Cobblers who made shoes were dead, forcing people to go barefoot or wear footwear that fell apart. The thousand small crafts that made civilization possible simply vanished, leaving communities helpless to maintain even the most basic aspects of material life. Money itself became meaningless in many plague-stricken areas. When most of the population was dead or dying, there was no one to trade with and nothing to buy. Merchants' stores stood empty, not because they had been looted, but because there were no customers left alive to purchase anything. Gold and silver, which had once been the measures of wealth and status, became as worthless as stones when there was no one left to accept them in trade. The breakdown of the monetary system forced survivors back into a primitive barter economy. But even this proved difficult to maintain. What good was it to trade grain for cloth when there were no tailors left alive to make the cloth into clothing? What value did luxury goods have when people were struggling just to find enough food and water to survive another day? The complex economic relationships that had made medieval society possible simply evaporated, leaving only the most basic struggle for survival. Transportation networks, which connected communities and allowed for trade and communication, also collapsed during the plague years. The roads that had once carried merchants, pilgrims, and messengers became dangerous and largely empty. Travelers were viewed with suspicion and fear, as they might be carrying the plague from infected areas. Bridges went unmaintained when the workers responsible for their upkeep died. Ferries stopped running when the ferrymen succumbed to disease. The isolation that resulted made it impossible for communities to help each other, or even to know what was happening in neighboring areas. The collapse of communication networks meant that news traveled slowly, if at all. Communities might be completely wiped out without their neighbors knowing what had happened. Relief efforts became impossible because no one knew where help was needed most urgently. The sense of isolation and abandonment that this created was perhaps as devastating as the physical effects of the plague itself. Survivors felt cut off not just from the wider world, but from the very idea that there was a wider world beyond their immediate struggle for survival. Seasonal activities that had marked the rhythm of medieval life came to a complete halt. Spring planting was abandoned when there were no farmers left alive to sow the seeds. Summer harvests rotted in the fields when there were no workers to gather them. Autumn preparations for winter were ignored because people were too focused on surviving from day to day to plan for the future. Winter brought additional hardships as people found themselves without adequate food, fuel, or shelter because no one had been able to make the necessary preparations during the warmer months. The animals that shared medieval communities with humans also suffered and died. Livestock that depended on human care for food and water were often the first to perish when their owners died. Cattle, pigs, chickens, and sheep would be found dead in their pens, having starved to death because there was no one left to feed them. Wild animals, attracted by the abundance of corpses, would venture into abandoned settlements, creating an eerie sight of wolves and ravens claiming territory that had once belonged to humans. Domestic animals like cats and dogs faced their own struggles. While some might survive by scavenging, many died of starvation or disease. The few animals that did survive often became feral, forming packs that roamed the empty streets and added to the sense that civilization itself was reverting to a more primitive state. Buildings and infrastructure began to deteriorate rapidly. Without human maintenance, roofs leaked when there was no one to repair them. Walls cracked and crumbled when there were no masons to fix them. Gardens became overgrown with weeds. Orchards went unpruned and their fruit fell and rotted on the ground. The physical evidence of human civilization began to disappear almost as quickly as the humans themselves. Fire became both a tool and a terror during the plague years. Survivors would burn infected houses in an attempt to stop the spread of disease, sometimes destroying entire neighborhoods in the process. Accidental fires, which in normal times would have been quickly contained by organized firefighting efforts, burned out of control when there was no one left to fight them. Some communities were as thoroughly destroyed by fire as by plague, leaving nothing but charred ruins to mark where thousands had once lived. The few people who survived this complete social collapse often found themselves living in a world that bore no resemblance to the one they had known. They might be the only person left alive in a town that had once housed thousands. They would wander through empty streets, past houses filled with corpses, past shops that would never open again, past churches that would never again ring their bells. Some survivors went mad from the isolation and horror. Others simply lay down and died, not from disease but from despair. Yet even in this wasteland, some traces of human resilience could be found. Small groups of survivors would sometimes band together, creating new communities from the ashes of the old. They would salvage what they could from the ruins, bury the dead when possible, and try to rebuild some semblance of normal life. But these new communities were fragile and often temporary. Another outbreak of plague, a harsh winter, or simply the psychological burden of living surrounded by so much death could destroy them as easily as they had been created. The collapse of daily life during the Black Death years was so complete that it seemed to many survivors that the world itself was ending. And in a very real sense, it was. The medieval world, with its complex social structures, economic relationships, and cultural traditions, died along with its people. What emerged from the ashes would be something different, something that had been forged in the fires of unimaginable loss and trauma. The plague didn't just change history, it ended one version of human civilization and forced the survivors to create another from nothing but ruins and memories. When the Black Death struck Europe, it revealed the complete inadequacy of medieval medicine and religion to deal with a crisis of such magnitude. The learned physicians, trained in the ancient texts of Galen and Hippocrates, found themselves as helpless as common peasants when faced with a disease that defied every principle they had been taught. The Church, which had promised to provide comfort and salvation to the faithful, discovered that prayers and holy water were no match for a plague that killed priests as readily as sinners. Medieval medicine in the 14th century was based on theories that had been developed more than 1,000 years earlier by Greek and Roman physicians. The foundation of medical practice was the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to this ancient wisdom, disease was caused by an imbalance of these humors within the body, and treatment involved restoring the proper balance through various means. Bloodletting was the most common treatment, based on the belief that many illnesses were caused by an excess of blood. Physicians would cut veins or apply leeches to drain what they considered to be surplus blood from the patient's body. When the first cases of plague appeared, physicians confidently applied their traditional treatments. They diagnosed the disease as an excess of corrupted blood, and immediately began bloodletting on a massive scale. Patients who were already weakened by fever and disease were further debilitated by having their blood drained. Instead of improving, they died faster and in greater numbers. But rather than questioning their methods, many physicians assumed they simply weren't bleeding their patients enough and increased the frequency and volume of bloodletting. Purging was another standard treatment that proved disastrously inappropriate for plague victims. Physicians believed that disease could be expelled from the body through vomiting and diarrhea, so they administered powerful laxatives and emetics to patients who were already suffering from dehydration and weakness. The herbs and compounds used for purging were often toxic in their own right, adding poisoning to the list of afflictions suffered by plague victims. Patients who might have survived the plague itself often died from the treatments designed to cure them. The theory of miasma, or bad air, was another cornerstone of medieval medical thinking. Physicians believed that disease was caused by breathing corrupted air, particularly air that had been tainted by rotting organic matter. This theory wasn't entirely wrong, as poor sanitation and contamination did contribute to the spread of disease, but it led to treatments that were often more harmful than helpful. Physicians recommended that patients avoid night air, which was considered particularly dangerous, and instead prescribed breathing air that had been purified by burning various herbs and spices. The wealthy would burn expensive aromatics like frankincense and myrrh, while the poor made do with whatever they could find. Some physicians recommended holding strong-smelling herbs or flowers to the nose, leading to the development of plague masks with long beaks that could be stuffed with aromatic substances. These bizarre contraptions made doctors look like giant birds and probably did nothing to prevent infection. But they became one of the most iconic images associated with the Black Death. University-trained physicians were few in number and expensive to consult, so most people relied on local healers, barbers, and wise women for medical care. These practitioners had no formal education but often possessed practical knowledge gained through years of experience. However, the plague was unlike any disease they had encountered before, and their traditional remedies proved just as ineffective as the sophisticated treatments prescribed by learned doctors. Barber surgeons, who combined hair cutting with medical procedures, were often the first medical professionals that ordinary people consulted during the plague years. They performed bloodletting, tooth extraction, and minor surgery, and they were familiar with treating wounds and common illnesses. But the plague overwhelmed their limited skills. Many barber surgeons simply fled when they realized that their treatments were not only ineffective but were putting them at risk of infection. Folk medicine offered a vast array of supposed cures for the plague. Some people believed that wearing certain stones or metals could protect them from disease. Amber, coral, and emeralds were thought to have protective properties, while iron and silver were believed to repel evil influences. Amulets and charms were worn around the neck or sewn into clothing. Many of these beliefs had roots in pre-Christian traditions and represented a desperate return to ancient superstitions when newer methods failed. Herbal remedies were tried in enormous variety and often dangerous combinations. Variac, a complex mixture of dozens of ingredients, including snake flesh and various spices, was considered a universal antidote to poison and disease. It was enormously expensive and difficult to prepare correctly, but desperate people would pay any price for something that promised hope. Other popular remedies included unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, which was ground into powder and mixed with wine, and bezoar stones, calcified masses found in animal stomachs, which were thought to neutralize poison. The search for effective treatments led to increasingly desperate and bizarre experiments. Some physicians recommended swallowing ground pearls or gold dust, believing that these precious substances could purify the blood. Others prescribed drinking human urine, particularly that of young children, on the theory that innocence could counteract corruption. Crushed human skull was mixed into potions, as was the blood of martyrs when it could be obtained. Animal-based treatments were common and often disgusting. Patients were encouraged to breathe the air from latrines, on the theory that bad smells could drive out bad humors. Live chickens or puppies were applied to buboes in the belief that the animals would draw out the disease. Snake oil, literally oil rendered from serpents, was rubbed on infected areas. Dried and powdered toads were eaten or applied to wounds. None of these treatments had any beneficial effect, and many probably made patients sicker. The failure of medicine led many people to turn to religion for both explanation and cure. The church taught that disease was often a punishment for sin, either individual transgressions or collective wickedness that had angered God. This belief led to an explosion of penitential activities. As people desperately tried to appease divine wrath, public processions of flagellants became common, with groups of penitents whipping themselves bloody as they marched from town to town, believing that their suffering could earn forgiveness for the sins that had brought the plague upon the world. These flagellant processions often became mass hysteria events that spread disease even more rapidly. Hundreds or thousands of people would gather to watch or participate, creating exactly the kind of crowded conditions that favored plague transmission. The flagellants themselves, weakened by their self-inflicted wounds and poor living conditions as they traveled, were particularly susceptible to infection. Many processions that started with hundreds of participants would end with only a handful of survivors. Prayer became the most common response to the plague, with people spending hours on their knees begging for divine intervention. Churches that remained open were packed with worshippers seeking salvation or simply comfort in familiar rituals. Special plague masses were celebrated, and new prayers were composed specifically to address the crisis. The most popular was the Dies Irae, or Day of Wrath, a haunting hymn that spoke of the coming judgment day and the need for repentance. Pilgrimages to holy sites increased dramatically as people sought miraculous cures or spiritual protection. Shrines that claimed to house relics of saints known for healing drew thousands of desperate pilgrims. The shrine of Saint Roch, who was believed to have survived the plague himself, became particularly popular. However, these mass gatherings of sick and healthy people together created ideal conditions for spreading the disease even further. The sale of religious relics and indulgences boomed during the plague years. People would pay enormous sums for what they believed were fragments of the true cross. Pieces of saints' clothing, or vials of holy water that had supposedly worked miracles. The church officially discouraged the commercialization of salvation. But local priests and traveling monks often took advantage of desperate believers. Fake relics flooded the market, with ordinary bones being passed off as saints' remains and common water being sold as blessed liquid from sacred springs. Confession became a frantic activity as people tried to cleanse their souls before death. Priests who remained at their posts found themselves overwhelmed with penitents who wanted to confess every sin they had ever committed. Some spent their final days in an endless cycle of confession, communion, and prayer, believing that spiritual purity might protect them from physical disease. The demand for last rites was so great that the church eventually authorized lay people to perform the sacrament when no priest was available. Supernatural explanations for the plague multiplied as rational medicine failed. Some believed that the disease was caused by a conjunction of planets that had corrupted the air. Others blamed comets, earthquakes, or eclipses for disturbing the natural order and releasing pestilence into the world. Astrological charts were consulted to determine the most auspicious times for treatment or travel. Almanacs that claimed to predict plague outbreaks based on astronomical observations became bestsellers among the literate population. Scapegoating became a common response when medical and religious solutions failed. Jewish communities were particularly targeted. Accused of poisoning wells or practicing dark magic that had summoned the plague, these accusations led to horrific massacres as Christian populations, driven mad by fear and loss, turned on their Jewish neighbors. Entire Jewish quarters were burned, and thousands of innocent people were tortured and killed. The irony was that Jewish communities often had lower rates of plague infection due to religious practices that emphasized cleanliness and ritual washing. But this only fueled suspicions that they possessed secret knowledge or protection. Women, particularly those who practiced folk medicine or midwifery, were often accused of witchcraft when their treatments failed to cure plague victims. The logic was cruelly circular. If a woman's remedies worked, she might be suspected of supernatural knowledge. If they failed, she might be accused of deliberately causing harm. Many wise women and healers who had served their communities for years found themselves facing accusations of consorting with demons or brewing poisons. Foreigners and travelers were also blamed for bringing the plague to communities. Strangers were viewed with extreme suspicion, and many towns began closing their gates to all outsiders. This isolationist response sometimes slowed the spread of disease, but it also cut off communities from potential sources of food, medicine, and aid. Villages that successfully kept the plague out often faced starvation when trade stopped and harvests failed. The failure of established authorities led to the rise of charismatic figures who claimed to have special knowledge or divine inspiration. Self-proclaimed prophets emerged in many communities, offering new explanations for the plague and radical solutions for ending it. Some preached that the end times were at hand, and that only through complete renunciation of worldly goods could people achieve salvation. Others claimed that specific rituals or sacrifices would appease God's wrath and stop the dying. These plague prophets often attracted large followings among desperate populations. Some established temporary communes where followers shared all possessions and spent their time in continuous prayer and fasting. Others led their disciples on dangerous journeys to supposed safe havens or holy sites. Many of these movements ended tragically when their leaders died of plague or their promised solutions proved worthless. Medical schools and universities, which had been growing in prestige and influence throughout the medieval period, found their reputations severely damaged by their inability to deal with the plague. Students abandoned their studies to flee infected cities, and professors died alongside their pupils. The University of Paris, one of the most prestigious medical schools in Europe, lost much of its faculty and had to suspend operations. When it reopened, there was a noticeable shift toward more practical, observational approaches to medicine and less reliance on ancient texts. The complete failure of medieval medicine and religion to provide effective responses to the Black Death created a crisis of authority that would have lasting effects on European society. People began to question institutions that had been unquestionable for centuries. If learned doctors couldn't heal the sick and holy priests couldn't prevent divine punishment, what good were they? This skepticism would eventually contribute to major changes in both medical practice and religious belief, though these transformations would take generations to fully develop. Some physicians and clerics, to their credit, remained at their posts despite the obvious dangers and continued to serve their communities even when their treatments proved ineffective. These individuals earned respect and gratitude from survivors, but they also paid a heavy price. Medical professionals had mortality rates as high as any other group, and many priests died performing last rites or comforting plague victims. Their sacrifice demonstrated that courage and compassion could persist even when knowledge and faith seemed inadequate. The search for plague cures also led to some genuine medical advances, though these were largely accidental. Physicians began to pay more attention to symptoms and disease progression, leading to better clinical observation skills. The failure of traditional treatments encouraged some practitioners to experiment with new approaches, laying groundwork for more scientific methods. The urgent need for practical solutions also led to increased interest in surgery and anatomy, fields that had been relatively neglected in favor of theoretical medicine. The Black Death ultimately revealed that the medieval understanding of disease was fundamentally flawed, but it also demonstrated human resilience in the face of the incomprehensible. When established authorities failed, ordinary people found ways to care for each other and maintain hope even in the darkest circumstances. The plague killed millions, but it also taught valuable lessons about the limits of human knowledge and the importance of empirical observation. These lessons would eventually contribute to the development of more effective medical practices, though that progress would come too late to help the victims of the Black Death. The Black Death didn't just kill bodies, it murdered the very soul of medieval society. As the plague swept across Europe, it stripped away the carefully constructed social fabric that had taken centuries to weave, revealing the fragile nature of human civilization and the thin line that separated order from chaos. What emerged from this devastation was a world where the most fundamental human relationships had been poisoned by fear, where love had become a liability, and where survival often required the abandonment of everything that had once made life worth living. The family, which had served as the basic unit of medieval society, was the first casualty of social breakdown. For centuries, European families had been bound together by complex networks of obligation, affection, and mutual dependence. Children cared for aging parents, parents sacrificed for their children, and extended family members provided support during times of crisis. But the plague made such closeness deadly. Caring for a sick relative meant almost certain infection, and families faced agonizing choices between love and survival. The speed with which the plague killed meant that these decisions had to be made quickly, often within hours of a family member showing symptoms. Some families made the heroic choice to stay together, nursing their sick relatives despite the obvious danger. These families often died together, sometimes within days of each other, leaving empty houses as monuments to their loyalty and love. Other families made the pragmatic choice to abandon their sick members, fleeing to what they hoped would be safer locations. These survivors carried with them not just the trauma of loss, but the crushing guilt of abandonment. Children were often the first to be abandoned when families faced impossible choices. Parents who might risk their own lives to care for a sick spouse would sometimes flee rather than watch their children suffer and die. Conversely, some parents abandoned sick children to protect healthy siblings, making heartbreaking calculations about which family members were most likely to survive. The result was thousands of orphaned children wandering through plague-stricken communities, many of them already infected and destined to die alone. The elderly, who had traditionally been revered and cared for by their descendants, found themselves cast aside as burdens that families could no longer afford to bear. Old people who had spent their lives serving their families were left to die alone in empty houses, too weak to care for themselves and too dangerous for others to approach. The traditional respect for age and wisdom that had characterized medieval society evaporated under the pressure of survival, replaced by a cold calculation of who was worth saving and who was not. Marriage, one of the most sacred institutions in medieval society, became a casualty of the plague years. Couples who had promised to stay together in sickness and in health found their vows tested in ways they had never imagined. Some spouses fled when their partners fell ill, reasoning that saving one life was better than losing two. Others remained faithful to the end, nursing their loved ones through agonizing deaths and often dying themselves shortly afterward. The plague created widows and widowers in unprecedented numbers, many of them still young but unlikely to remarry for fear of forming new attachments that disease might sever. The concept of romantic love, which had been celebrated in medieval literature and courtly culture, seemed naive and dangerous in a world where intimacy meant death. Young couples postponed marriages indefinitely, unwilling to commit to relationships that might end in mutual destruction. The elaborate courtship rituals that had characterized medieval romance were abandoned in favor of more practical considerations. Was a potential spouse healthy? Did they come from an uninfected area? Could they contribute to survival rather than merely emotional fulfillment? Childbirth, always dangerous in the medieval period, became even more perilous during the plague years. Pregnant women faced not only the usual risks of labor and delivery, but also the possibility that the stress and malnutrition caused by the plague might complicate their pregnancies. Many women chose to avoid pregnancy entirely, seeing it as an unacceptable risk in an uncertain world. Others who did give birth often died shortly afterward, leaving infants who had little chance of survival without mothers to nurse them. The children who did survive the plague years grew up in a world that bore little resemblance to the stable, structured society their parents had known. Many were orphans who had been forced to fend for themselves from an early age. They formed gangs and makeshift families, learning to steal, scavenge, and fight for resources. These plague children, as they came to be known, had few memories of normal family life and little understanding of the social norms that had governed their parents' generation. The breakdown of family structures had profound effects on the transmission of culture and knowledge. In medieval society, most education took place within the family, with parents teaching children the skills they would need to survive and prosper. When families disintegrated, this informal education system collapsed. Children grew up without learning basic crafts, agricultural techniques, or social behavior. The accumulated wisdom of generations was lost, as elderly family members died before they could pass on their knowledge to younger relatives. Religious communities, which had provided stability and continuity during previous crises, were devastated by the plague. Monasteries and convents, where monks and nuns lived in close quarters and cared for the sick as part of their religious duties, experienced mortality rates that were often even higher than those in secular communities. Entire religious houses were wiped out, taking with them not only the individuals but also the libraries, artistic works, and scholarly traditions they had preserved. The loss of religious communities had effects that extended far beyond their walls. Monasteries had served as centers of learning, medical care, and social services. They provided education for the children of the nobility, copied and preserved manuscripts, and offered assistance to the poor and sick. When these institutions collapsed, the services they provided simply disappeared, leaving gaps in society that would take generations to fill. The few monks and nuns who survived often found their faith shaken by the experiences they had endured. Some abandoned their religious vows entirely, reasoning that a God who would allow such suffering was not worthy of worship. Others became even more extreme in their religious practices, engaging in severe forms of self-mortification in an attempt to appease divine wrath. A few turned to heretical beliefs, joining radical movements that promised new forms of salvation or revenge against the forces that had destroyed their world. The guild system, which had organized craft production and maintained quality standards for centuries, collapsed along with the families and communities it had served. Master craftsmen died before they could train apprentices, taking their skills and techniques to the grave. Journeymen who might have become masters found themselves without workshops or customers. The carefully maintained distinctions between different levels of craftsmen became meaningless when there were too few survivors to maintain the system. The breakdown of guild structures had immediate practical consequences. Quality control disappeared, leading to inferior goods and unsafe practices. Price controls were abandoned, allowing surviving merchants to charge whatever they thought the market would bear. The mutual aid systems that guilds had provided to their members evaporated, leaving craftsmen and their families without support during times of illness or economic hardship. Trade networks, which had connected communities across vast distances, were severed as the plague killed merchants, destroyed transportation systems, and made travel extremely dangerous. Cities that had depended on imported goods found themselves cut off from their suppliers. Rural areas that had specialized in producing goods for export were left with surpluses they couldn't sell and shortages of items they couldn't produce locally. The economic integration that had characterized medieval Europe gave way to a patchwork of isolated communities struggling for self-sufficiency. The collapse of trade had particularly severe effects on urban areas, which had grown large and prosperous by specializing in manufacturing and commerce rather than food production. Cities that had once housed tens of thousands of people were abandoned as survivors fled to rural areas where they might be able to grow their own food. The great commercial centers of medieval Europe became ghost towns, their empty buildings slowly deteriorating as nature began to reclaim them. Legal systems, which had provided a framework for resolving disputes and maintaining order, became irrelevant when there were no judges, no juries, and no authorities to enforce decisions. Courts closed as legal officials died or fled. Laws that had governed everything from property rights to criminal behavior were ignored or forgotten. The elaborate legal codes that had been developed over centuries of careful thought and precedent simply ceased to function. In the absence of formal legal systems, communities fell back on more primitive forms of justice. Vigilante groups formed to deal with criminals and disputes. Trial by combat and other archaic practices were revived. Some communities adopted summary execution for even minor crimes, reasoning that they couldn't afford to maintain prisons or give criminals second chances. The rule of law, which had been one of the great achievements of medieval civilization, was replaced by the rule of force. Property rights, which had formed the foundation of the feudal system, became meaningless when there was no one left to claim or defend them. Vast estates were abandoned when their owners died and no heirs survived to inherit them. Peasants who had been bound to the land for generations found themselves free to leave, not because they had been granted freedom, but because there was no one left to stop them. Land that had been carefully cultivated for centuries reverted to wilderness as there were no longer enough people to work it. The breakdown of property rights created opportunities for those ruthless enough to seize them. Some survivors became wealthy, by looting abandoned houses and claiming empty lands. Others formed bands of raiders, who took whatever they wanted from communities too weak to toast. The careful balance between different social classes that had characterized medieval society was replaced by a brutal struggle in which might made right. Currency and monetary systems collapsed in many areas as trade ceased and governments fell. Coins became worthless pieces of metal when there was nothing to buy and no one to trade with. Barter systems emerged, but even these were difficult to maintain when most communities were focused simply on survival rather than exchange. The complex financial instruments that had been developed by medieval bankers and merchants became irrelevant overnight. Social hierarchies that had seemed permanent and divinely ordained were revealed to be human constructions that could disappear as quickly as the people who maintained them. Nobles, who had ruled through hereditary right, found their authority challenged when their subjects had nothing left to lose. Peasants, who had been taught from birth to accept their inferior status, discovered that death made everyone equal. The elaborate ceremonies and rituals that had reinforced social distinctions seemed ridiculous in a world where survival was the only thing that mattered. Some survivors attempted to maintain the old social order even in the face of catastrophe. They continued to observe the forms of medieval courtesy and hierarchy, dressing in their finest clothes and holding formal ceremonies even when most of their communities were dead. These efforts to preserve civilization were often touching in their futility, representing a desperate desire to maintain human dignity in the face of inhumane circumstances. Others embraced the collapse of social order as an opportunity for liberation. Peasants who had been oppressed for generations saw the plague as divine justice against their oppressors. Some formed egalitarian communities where all property was held in common and all decisions were made collectively. These experiments in social reorganization were usually short-lived, but they demonstrated that the plague had created space for new forms of human organization. The psychological effects of social breakdown were as devastating as the physical effects of the plague itself. People who had defined themselves through their relationships to family, community, and social institutions found themselves adrift in a world where none of these anchors remained. The loss of social identity was particularly severe for those who had held positions of authority or respect. Nobles became no different from peasants when their lands were empty and their retainers were dead. Priests became indistinguishable from common people when their churches were abandoned and their congregations were gone. Many survivors suffered from what would now be recognized as severe depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. They had witnessed horrors that their minds were not equipped to process. The deaths of everyone they had ever loved, the collapse of everything they had believed in, the transformation of familiar places into landscapes of death and decay. Some retreated into madness as a form of escape from an unbearable reality. Others became emotionally numb, unable to feel joy or sorrow or to form new attachments. The few communities that managed to maintain some semblance of order during the plague years often did so by adopting extreme measures that would have been unthinkable in normal times. Some became military dictatorships ruled by whoever had the most weapons and the will to use them. Others developed rigid religious hierarchies led by charismatic figures who claimed divine authority. Still others adopted communistic systems where all resources were shared equally, and individual desires were subordinated to group survival. These surviving communities often became insular and suspicious of outsiders. Having learned through bitter experience that contact with the outside world usually brought death, they developed elaborate rituals for testing strangers and quarantining anyone who might be infected. Some communities adopted policies of killing anyone who showed signs of illness, reasoning that sacrificing individuals was necessary to save the group. The children who grew up in these altered communities often developed very different values and behaviors from their parents. Having never known a world of plenty and stability, they were more accepting of violence, more suspicious of strangers and more focused on immediate survival than long-term planning. These plague generations would carry the trauma of their experiences forward, influencing European society for centuries to come. Art and literature from the plague years reflected the breakdown of social order and the transformation of human values. Religious art became darker and more focused on death and judgment. Secular literature explored themes of betrayal, abandonment, and survival. Music became more melancholy, reflecting the grief and despair that had become the dominant emotions of the age. The plague also accelerated changes that had been developing slowly in medieval society. The breakdown of feudalism, which had been weakening for decades, was completed in a matter of years. The rise of centralized nation-states was hastened as local authorities collapsed and only powerful monarchs had the resources to maintain order. The growth of capitalism was encouraged as traditional economic relationships disappeared, and new forms of wealth and power emerged. In the end, the social breakdown caused by the Black Death was as significant as the disease itself in reshaping European civilization. The plague killed bodies, but the collapse of social order killed ways of life that had existed for centuries. The survivors were forced to create new forms of human organization from the ruins of the old, and the societies they built were fundamentally different from what had come before. The medieval world died with its people, and what emerged was something entirely new. The foundation of the modern world, built on the graves of the old. When the Black Death finally began to loosen its grip on Europe in the early 1350s, the continent that emerged from the shadow of plague was unrecognizable from the one that had existed just a few years before. The numbers alone told a story of devastation beyond comprehension. Between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's entire population had perished. Entire bloodlines had been extinguished. Ancient cities had been reduced to collections of empty houses. Vast stretches of cultivated land had returned to wilderness. But the true transformation went far deeper than mere statistics could capture. The Black Death had fundamentally altered the DNA of European civilization, creating changes that would echo through the centuries and shape the modern world in ways that the survivors could never have imagined. The demographic catastrophe was unprecedented in human history. England, which had boasted a population of perhaps 4 million people before the plague, found itself reduced to barely 2 million survivors. France, the most populous and powerful kingdom in Europe, lost an estimated 17 million people out of a pre-plague population of 25 million. Some regions were hit even harder. Tuscany lost 2/3 of its inhabitants, while parts of Germany saw mortality rates approach 70%. These weren't just numbers on a page. They represented the complete disappearance of communities, the extinction of family lines that had existed for centuries, and the loss of accumulated knowledge and culture that could never be recovered. The immediate aftermath of such massive population loss created a world that seemed almost post-apocalyptic. Travelers moving through the European countryside in the 1350s described landscapes that looked as though they had been abandoned for decades rather than years. Fields that had been carefully cultivated for generations were overgrown with weeds and brush. Orchards had gone wild, their unpruned trees producing smaller and smaller crops until they ceased bearing fruit altogether. Vineyards which required constant care and attention had withered and died, leaving behind only twisted vines and broken stakes. Villages that had once housed hundreds of families were reduced to a handful of occupied houses, surrounded by empty shells slowly crumbling back into the earth. Churches stood silent, their bells removed or fallen from neglected towers. Markets that had operated for centuries simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only empty squares where grass grew between ancient paving stones. The physical infrastructure of medieval civilization was decaying as rapidly as the social structures that had created it. In the cities, the situation was often even more dramatic. Urban areas, which had depended on complex networks of trade and specialization, were particularly vulnerable to population loss. Many cities lost not just people, but their entire reason for existence. Many cities lost not just people, but their entire reason for existence. Some cities adapted by contracting, abandoning entire neighborhoods, and concentrating the remaining population in smaller, more defensible areas. Others were abandoned entirely, their empty buildings serving as monuments to the civilization that had created them. The great urban revival that had characterized the High Middle Ages came to an abrupt halt, and Europe began to look more rural and decentralized than it had for centuries. But from this devastation came opportunities that would have been unimaginable before the plague. The massive loss of population meant that the survivors inherited a world with far more resources per capita than had existed for generations. Land, which had been scarce and expensive before the plague, became abundant and cheap. Peasants who had been bound to tiny plots suddenly found themselves with access to vast estates. Survivors could pick and choose among abandoned farms, selecting the best land and leaving the marginal areas to return to forest. This abundance of land fundamentally altered the relationship between labor and capital. Before the plague, labor had been cheap and land expensive, creating a system where landowners held all the power and workers had little bargaining leverage. After the plague, the situation was reversed. Land was abundant, but workers were scarce, giving ordinary people bargaining power they had never possessed before. Peasants who had been bound to the soil for generations suddenly found landlords competing for their services, offering better terms, higher wages, and greater freedom. The economic transformation was swift and dramatic. Wages for agricultural workers increased by 50 to 100% in many areas, while rents for land fell to a fraction of their pre-plague levels. Surviving peasants found themselves with more cash income than their families had ever possessed, allowing them to purchase goods and services that had previously been reserved for the wealthy. The rigid economic hierarchies of medieval society began to blur as death had redistributed wealth in ways that centuries of social evolution had not. The scarcity of skilled workers created even more dramatic changes in urban areas. Craftsmen who had survived the plague found themselves in enormous demand, able to charge premium prices for their services and dictate terms to employers who desperately needed their skills. Guild restrictions that had previously limited access to lucrative trades were relaxed or abandoned entirely as masters sought to train new apprentices as quickly as possible. Social mobility, which had been virtually impossible in the rigid hierarchies of pre-plague society, became not just possible but common. The Catholic Church, which had been the dominant institution in medieval Europe, emerged from the plague years weakened and changed. The loss of so many clergy had forced the Church to ordinate men with less education and training than had previously been required. The failure of prayers and religious rituals to stop the plague had damaged the Church's credibility and authority. Many survivors had witnessed priests fleeing from their duties or dying alongside common people, undermining the belief that clergy possessed special divine protection. More fundamentally, the plague had raised theological questions that the Church struggled to answer satisfactorily. If God was just and merciful, why had he allowed such suffering to afflict the faithful? Why had the plague killed virtuous people alongside sinners, children alongside adults, clergy alongside lay people? The traditional explanations of disease as divine punishment for sin seemed inadequate when applied to a catastrophe that had struck so indiscriminately. These theological challenges contributed to the growth of popular religious movements that offered alternative interpretations of Christian doctrine. Mystical traditions that emphasized personal religious experience rather than institutional authority gained followers. Heretical movements that questioned church teachings about salvation and divine justice found receptive audiences among survivors who had witnessed the failure of traditional religion to provide protection or comfort during the plague years. The political consequences of the plague were equally profound. The feudal system, which had been based on personal relationships between lords and vassals, became increasingly difficult to maintain when so many of the people involved in these relationships had died. Kings found their noble vassals decimated, while surviving nobles discovered that their peasant subjects had either died or fled to seek better conditions elsewhere. The careful web of obligations and loyalties that had held medieval society together simply unraveled. In many areas, royal power actually increased as traditional noble families were wiped out and their lands reverted to the crown. Kings could redistribute these estates to new nobles who owed their positions entirely to royal favor, creating more centralized and bureaucratic forms of government. The rise of professional administrators and standing armies was accelerated as monarchs sought to govern territories that could no longer be managed through traditional feudal relationships. The concept of national identity, which had been developing slowly throughout the medieval period, was strengthened by the shared experience of surviving the plague. Communities that had endured the catastrophe together developed stronger bonds and a greater sense of common identity. The breakdown of local and regional authorities made people more likely to look to distant kings and national institutions for leadership and protection. The labor shortage created by the plague also accelerated technological innovation and adoption. Landowners who couldn't find enough workers to cultivate their fields manually began investing in watermills, windmills, and other labor-saving devices. Agricultural techniques that increased productivity per worker were developed and spread more rapidly. The economic incentive to find alternatives to human labor drove innovation in ways that abundant cheap labor had never done. Urban craftsmen similarly began developing new tools and techniques that would allow fewer workers to produce more goods. The printing press, which would revolutionize communication and learning, was invented in part because the plague had killed so many scribes and copyists that there was enormous demand for more efficient ways of reproducing texts. The mechanical innovations of the late medieval period were often direct responses to the labor shortage created by the Black Death. The plague also transformed European attitudes toward education and learning. The massive loss of educated clergy and professionals created an urgent need for new forms of training and knowledge transmission. Universities that had been primarily focused on theology and abstract philosophy began offering more practical curricula that could train administrators, lawyers, and other professionals needed in the post-plague world. The vernacular languages of Europe gained prestige and importance as Latin literacy declined due to the death of so many educated clergy. Literature began to be written in local languages rather than Latin, making it accessible to broader audiences. The works of Chalker in English, Dante in Italian, and other vernacular authors reflected not just linguistic change, but a broader democratization of culture that the plague had accelerated. Art and architecture from the post-plague period reflected the psychological and spiritual impact of the catastrophe. The elegant, optimistic Gothic style that had characterized the High Middle Ages gave way to more somber and realistic artistic expressions. Religious art increasingly focused on themes of death, judgment, and the transience of earthly life. The memento mori tradition, which reminded viewers of their mortality, became increasingly popular. Secular art also changed, with greater emphasis on individual portraiture and realistic depiction of daily life. The abundance of wealth among survivors created a new market for luxury goods and artistic commissions, but the subjects and styles chosen often reflected the changed values and perspectives of people who had lived through unprecedented catastrophe. The Black Death had profound effects on European family structure and gender relations. The high mortality rates meant that many surviving women found themselves widowed at young ages, often inheriting property and businesses from their deceased husbands. Some of these women discovered that they had greater independence and economic power than women had traditionally possessed in medieval society. While legal and social restrictions still limited women's rights, The practical necessities of survival in a depopulated world often forced communities to accept female leadership in areas where it had previously been forbidden. Marriage patterns also changed significantly. The abundance of available land and resources meant that young people could afford to marry earlier and establish independent households more easily than had been possible before the plague. The traditional pattern of late marriage and extended periods of service in other households gave way to earlier family formation and greater economic independence for young couples. The plague years had also created thousands of orphans who grew up without traditional family structures. Many of these children developed different attitudes toward authority, social hierarchy, and individual rights than their parents had possessed. The generation that came of age in the decades following the plague was often more questioning of traditional authority and more willing to challenge established social norms. Scientific and medical thought was also transformed by the plague experience. The complete failure of traditional medical approaches to treat the disease had demonstrated the inadequacy of medieval medical theory. Physicians who survived began to place greater emphasis on clinical observation and practical experience, rather than relying solely on ancient texts. The foundations were laid for more empirical approaches to medical practice that would eventually lead to genuine scientific advancement. The plague also stimulated interest in public health measures and epidemic control. Communities that had survived multiple outbreaks began developing quarantine procedures, sanitation requirements, and other public health policies that were based on practical observation of how disease spread rather than theoretical medical principle. These early public health measures were often crude and sometimes ineffective, but they represented important steps toward more scientific approaches to disease prevention. Economic thought was similarly influenced by the post-plague environment. The dramatic changes in wages, prices, and land values forced people to think more systematically about economic relationships. The traditional medieval economy, which had been based largely on custom and tradition, was replaced by more market-oriented approaches that emphasized supply and demand. These changes laid the groundwork for the development of more sophisticated economic theories and practices. The long-term cultural impact of the Black Death can be seen in the literature, philosophy, and art of subsequent centuries. The Renaissance emphasis on individual achievement and secular learning was partly a reaction to the massive loss of traditional institutional knowledge during the Plague years. The Protestant Reformation drew some of its energy from criticisms of the Catholic Church's failure to provide adequate spiritual guidance during the crisis. Even the scientific revolution of the 17th century can be traced in part to the breakdown of traditional authority and the emphasis on empirical observation that began during the Plague years. The demographic recovery from the Black Death was slow and uneven. It took Europe nearly 2 centuries to regain its pre-plague population levels, and some regions never fully recovered. But the society that emerged was fundamentally different from what had existed before. The rigid hierarchies and limited opportunities of medieval feudalism had been replaced by more fluid social structures and greater individual freedom. The local and regional focus of early medieval culture had given way to more national and international perspective. By the time European explorers began venturing beyond their continent in the late 15th century, they carried with them the accumulated changes and adaptations that had emerged from the Plague years. The technological innovations, economic systems, political structures, and cultural attitudes that would enable European expansion and dominance were all shaped in part by the catastrophe that had nearly destroyed European civilization 2 centuries earlier. The Black Death had been the worst disaster in European history, but it had also been a catalyst for changes that would make Europe the dominant force in world history for the next several centuries. The plague had killed the medieval world, but from its ashes had risen something new and powerful: the foundation of the modern age. The survivors of the Black Death had not merely endured. They had been transformed, and through their transformation they had changed the course of human history itself. In the end, The Black Death stands as perhaps the greatest example in human history of how catastrophic destruction can become creative transformation. The plague had torn down the old world so completely that the survivors had no choice but to build something entirely new. What they built was imperfect and often cruel, but it was also dynamic, innovative, and capable of achievements that would have been impossible under the old system. The Black Death had been Europe's darkest hour, but it had also been the birth pang of the modern world.